Battleships. Bigly huge American battleships. A patron of mine by the name of USS Texas, yes, I laughed at that too, asked a few months ago for a 5-minute history on the USS Texas, which I gave him. He then, the cheeky little bugger, requested every single American standard battleship. So I thought I'd do one better and cover every single American Dreadnought, because they don't really get that much love when you compare them to the Iowa fanboys, which are objectively wrong because the North Carolinas are way cooler anyway, and yeah, I'm counting the Sodaks there too. The North Carolinas are the best, just fight me. But anyway, like hell, I was going to do this alone. There's just too many of them to do this alone. It's ridiculous. So I reached out to my nearest snowbogan, who likes boats, Spartan, to join me. And I have it on good authority, he also enjoys pain and suffering, so I figured, with the amount of ships here, he could enjoy it as well. I didn't realise, though, that he was an anime fan, and, exorcisms aside, it's quite expensive to get to Canada at the moment, so we're just going to have to deal with that. I promise he's funny, though, and you should absolutely subscribe to his channel. He did videos on the Russian aircraft carriers. I know that sets you all off. Go on, check it out. Go on, do it. Do it. Anyway, to set us off today is the South Carolina class, or is it the Michigan class? Either, pick one. But either way, we're starting off with the South Carolina, because it's technically called the South Carolina class, so we're going to call it the South Carolina class. Now, by most metrics, the South Carolina and her sister Michigan are kind of meh, but they are the beginning of the US entry into the Dreadnought race triggered by the launch of HMS Dreadnought in 1906. The United States, unwilling to fall behind in the race after previously falling behind in naval power to Brazil of all places, responded with its own answer to the Dreadnought. South Carolina was the lead ship of a pair of early Dreadnought battleships and the fourth vessel of the United States Navy to bear the name of the eighth state in the Union. Generally speaking, the South Carolina was not as good as her British counterpart, as she did not have turbine propulsion like the HMS Dreadnought, but unlike the Dreadnought, she did have super-firing guns which gave her the same broadside number of guns, albeit without an extra fifth turret. And this would become the standard for future battleships around the world, so, little column A, little column B. The keel for the South Carolina was laid down at the William Cramp & Sons shipyard in Philadelphia on the 18th of December 1906, and the completed hull was launched on the 11th of July 2 years later. After some fitting out, she was commissioned into the fleet on the 1st of March 1910. The ship clocked in at 452 feet 9 inches in length, or 138 metres, with a beam of 24 metres, 80 feet, and a draft of 7 metres, 24 feet. She displaced up to 17,900 tonnes at full load, and her propulsion came from a pair of triple expansion steam engines rather than the newer turbines favoured by the British. This choice not to include the turbines was somewhat shocking given the idea of a dreadnought was pretty revolutionary, so you would have thought you'd go all out with it, but it was again largely down to Congress holding the purse strings and demanding that the Navy make sacrifices to get ships. This theme will continue as the video goes on. But for the South Carolina and her sister, that meant they were simply slow. Very slow. They could not keep up with later ships, let alone their contemporaries from Germany and the United Kingdom that were coming in the future. The ship was powered by 2-shaft vertical triple expansion engines rated at 16,500 horsepower and 12 coal-fired Babcock and Wilcox boilers, generating a top speed of 18.5 knots, with a crew of 869 officers and men. The big thing though was the guns. 8 uniform 12-inch guns in 4 twin turrets on the centerline, placed in 2 super-firing pairs fore and aft with a smaller secondary battery consisting of 22 3-inch guns mounted in casemates along the hull. For funsies as well, she carried a pair of 21-inch torpedo tubes submerged in the hull just in case she got close enough to smack anything. South Carolina had a pretty lackluster career though, like most dreadnoughts from the era. You will not be shocked to hear this kind of thing repeat over and over. Upon being accepted into service, she was assigned to the Atlantic Fleet, and 5 days after commissioning, she steamed out of Philadelphia for her shakedown cruise, which took the ship to the Caribbean Sea with stops in the Danish West Indies and Cuba, before returning for a visit to Charleston, in her namesake state, from the 10th to the 15th of April, where she was briefly open to the public. On the 1st of November 1910, South Carolina left the United States for a trip to Europe, with the 2nd Battleship Division stopping in Cherbourg and Portland before arriving back in Norfolk in January 1911. There was a second European voyage later that year, which included stops in Copenhagen, Stockholm, and Kronstadt. And on her way back from Kronstadt, South Carolina actually stopped in Kiel, where Kaiser Wilhelm II had a little sailing regatta. In the early 1910s, the US deployed naval power to protect its interests and citizens along the Mexican coast in response to the revolution, and in June 1913, the battleship departed for Mexico, where she cruised off Tampico and Veracruz without major incident. On the 28th of January 1914, the ship would send a contingent of Marines ashore in Port-au-Prince, Haiti to secure the American embassy during some unrest, and she would actually set up a radio station there before heading back to the Mexican coast and coaling at Key West and continuing on to Veracruz, where she took part in the occupation of the city in April. American forces seized the port in response to a diplomatic incident, and South Carolina was part of the naval force in that blockade. When the United States finally entered the First World War in April 1917, and no, it did not do it to save the Entente, South Carolina did not steam to European waters to fight alongside the Grand Fleet. By 1917, she was simply too old and aged by the standards of naval technology, and her role was one of training and support. This is largely due to the fact she was simply too slow to operate with the Royal Navy. She spent much of 1917 and 1918 drilling sailors for the wartime Navy along the East Coast instead. Late in the war, she did actually take on more active duties though. Starting in September 1918, South Carolina and other pre-dreadnoughts of the Atlantic Fleet began actually escorting convoys to France, which is a duty that her speed didn't actually hamper it too much. On the 6th of September, she departed with USS Kansas and USS New Hampshire to protect a troop convoy, but on the 17th, South Carolina lost her starboard propeller, which forced her to reduce speeds to 11 knots using only the port shaft. On the 20th, the port engine stopped after the throttle valve broke down, and after some quick hodgepodge repairs, she limped back to Philadelphia for a refit, saw no further service before the armistice was signed. The ship would, though, carry 4,000 American soldiers back home from Europe in the post-war drawdown, before she was relegated again to training cruises. In the 1920s, the South Carolina crossed into the Pacific via the Panama Canal, and having a brief stop at Hawaii, Seattle, and San Francisco, and San Diego, before she returned to Annapolis in September. In 1921, she took on midshipmen to Europe again, with ports of call including Kristiania in Norway and Lisbon in Portugal. The Washington Naval Treaty, signed in February 1922, did call for a reduction in battleship numbers, and given her age and how slow she was compared to other dreadnoughts, that Spartan and I will get into, the South Carolina was decommissioned in December 1921 and sold for scrap in April 1924. Interestingly, the silverware is still used, though, for entertaining dignitaries at the South Carolina Governor's Mansion. Well, one of the many silverwares that they have, but it is interesting that the battleship silverware did end up somewhere. Sister to the South Carolina, USS Michigan was built to essentially the same design, but funnily enough, she was launched and commissioned before the South Carolina, entering service on the 4th of January 1910, which has led to some people calling this class the Michigan class due to traditional naming conventions. Like South Carolina, she would be drawn into the Mexican Revolution in the 1910s, and during 1914, on her third cruise to Mexico, she would land a battalion of Marines as part of the occupation force at Veracruz. In December 1914, the ship would be tasked with testing new fire control directives to aid in gun laying, and these tests were successful, which led to fleet-wide change. In September 1916, during gunnery practice, a shell in the left forward gun of the superfiring turret actually exploded, which destroyed the barrel and showered the ship with debris. However, miraculously, this only injured one sailor and didn't kill anyone, which for a turret explosion is kind of shocking. That usually doesn't happen. Given the fact she had 12-inch guns, it's really a miracle that nobody died. Just 2 years later, on the 15th of January 1918, Michigan was cruising off Cape Hatteras on a training exercise when a heavy gale and rough seas knocked over her forward cage mast. The ship had rolled to port in the heavy seas before rolling back sharply to starboard, and the rapid change in direction snapped the mast at its narrowest point, which had already been damaged in that 1916 barrel explosion and only patched over. This accident unfortunately killed 6 men and injured another 13, and it would actually contribute to the decision to get rid of cage masts eventually. While on convoy escort duties in 1918, the Michigan also lost a screw and was forced to leave the convoy and return to port for repairs, remaining out of service for the rest of the war. Like her sister South Carolina, Michigan was denied any meaningful combat role before the armistice of 1918. Oh, and interestingly, when she lost her screw, she lost her port screw, and the South Carolina lost her starboard. So there's a full set out there for anyone who wants propellers on the cheap for their own early American dreadnought projects, so you just go swimming, I guess. Michigan would bring home 1,000 American soldiers in the post-war era, and like South Carolina, she would undertake some training cruises, and on these cruises, the ship's captain would actually be removed from Marxist sympathies due to the fact he introduced some committees designed to give sailors on the lower deck a voice. And the ship itself would be decommissioned in the Washington Naval Treaty in 1922, being scrapped in 23.
You're not gonna believe the audacity of this fella HOE. Mans kidnaps me off the streets, demands that I help him steal my whole flow for a video, and now he won't let me out of his basement until I talk about American battleships. He's also threatened to beat me with a ruler and wash my mouth out with soap if I swear. Please help me, I'm being held against my will. Well, I mean, since I'm here. Hi, I'm Spartan. For this particular endeavor, I have been conscripted by the one and only Homeowners Association himself, because gigantic videos about boats are fun. Anyways, let's get started with the Delaware class. The Delawares are kinda funny, because the South Carolinas hadn't even been laid down yet, and the Americans were already melting down over them potentially not being able to match HMS Dreadnought. American intelligence had screwed up, and they didn't know exactly how strong Dreadnought was. As a result, they were both correct and wrong. Dreadnought was a better ship, but only marginally. But this is the armed forces of the United Bloody States, after all, so they immediately began doom posting, assuming that the South Carolinas were going to be absolutely dumpstered by the British ship. This was partially because Congress had imposed size limits on battleships, and this fear gave the shipyards and naval designers an excuse to complain and have those restrictions reduced. After some good old-fashioned fear-mongering, Congress lifted them in June of 1906, in the process not so subtly giving the Navy a blank check to build ships as big as they so desired. Consequently, an order was almost immediately placed for two even better battleships that would become the Delaware class. The goal of these ships was to have lots of armor, lots of gun, and lots of speed. They were pretty much just better South Carolinas in basically every way, which is really funny because, again, the South Carolinas had yet to even be laid down and were therefore entirely obsolete before steel even hit the pavement. The ships were to displace 22,759 tons fully loaded, be able to make 21 knots, and carried 10 12-inch guns along with all sorts of secondaries. They also had torpedo tubes because who doesn't like a good old-fashioned demolition run with a battleship? The Delawares, as a result, were strictly better than the Dreadnought, especially since all of their guns could be brought to broadside due to their arrangement that would eventually become standard issue on all artillery-based warships going forward. This armament was complemented by pretty solid armor all things considered, and the result was a pair of well-rounded and effective battleships. The first of the two Delawares was the USS Delaware. Delaware was laid down on November 11th of 1907 by Newport News Shipbuilding in Virginia. She would be launched in January of 1909 and fully commissioned into the U.S. Navy in April of 1910. She would be attached to the Atlantic Fleet and didn't do that much because dreadnoughts never really did all that much. Her first major military mission was partaking in exercises off Cuba in January of 1911, during which one of her boilers exploded and killed a bunch of people. Her only other pre-war operation was participating in the occupation of Veracruz in Mexico in 1914 during the Revolution, primarily providing fire support, lodging, and transportation to occupation forces. Eventually, when the United States enters World War I, Delaware would be dispatched to join the British Grand Fleet up in Scapa Flow. She actually did see action in 1918, despite the fact that the British and German fleets were just edging each other for an entire year because Jutland had spooked everyone. She was primarily assigned to convoy escort, which is crazy because battleship, and she had a close encounter with a U-boot in February but managed to escape unharmed. At the end of July, she was relieved by the Arkansas and sent back across the pond where she proceeded to do basically nothing in peacetime. When the Washington Naval Treaty was concluded in 1922, she was earmarked for scrapping, which would occur in 1924. USS North Dakota was the second and final ship of the Delaware class. Her build and stats were functionally identical to her sister, and she was laid down on December 16th of 1907, launched in November of 1908, and completed and commissioned into the Atlantic Fleet in April of 1910. She began her service life by exploding in September. I wonder if this will become a theme with these ships. After this, though, her service life was even less eventful than her sister's. The only thing of note she did before 1917 was joining her sister and screwing around in Mexico in 1914. Then, when the Big World War rolled around, she was assigned to boring gunnery training duty and never left North American waters. After the war ended, she reverted back to just doing exercises and sailing around, as a part of which, in 1921, she partook in one exercise where she joined up with a bunch of airplanes to blow up a German battleship. After the signing of the Washington Naval Treaty, she was stripped of her armament and converted into a target ship, a role she served in until 1931, when she would be formally decommissioned and sold for scrap.
Following on from the Delawares came the Florida class, and kicking us off in this class is, shockingly, the USS Florida, commissioned in September 1911. Florida was one of the most capable battleships the United States Navy had produced to that point, and she was laid down at the New York Navy Yard in 1909, after being launched in May 1910. and commissioned into service finally in 1911. Built to be a step forward from the preceding Delaware, she was 521 feet 6 inches, or 159 metres long, and she clocked in at around 23,400 tonnes at full load on a hull that could reach a speed of just over 20 knots. Like previous American dreadnoughts, she sported 12-inch guns on a centerline battery, and the battery consisted of 10 mounts and 5 twin turrets along that centerline, with 2 placed in a superfiring pair forward and 3 positioned aft of the superstructures. A secondary battery of 16 5-inch guns was mounted in casemates along the hull, and she also carried a pair of 21-inch torpedo tubes submerged in her hull. The ship's armour profile was also improved compared to previous designs, but in general she followed the format laid out by her predecessors in the Delaware class. After commissioning, Florida spent her early years in the Atlantic Fleet for gunnery exercises and training along with midshipman cruisers, before a deployment alongside her sister Utah as the first capital ships to arrive in Veracruz on the 16th of February 1914. The two ships, along with USS Prairie, landed a contingent of over 1,000 Marines and sailors to begin the occupation of the city that April. Over the following 3 days, some fierce street fighting broke out between American forces and Mexican defenders, resulting in 94 American casualties, including 19 dead, while hundreds of Mexicans were also killed. The crew of the Florida distinguished themselves during this engagement, and 25 of them actually received the Medal of Honor, although the Medal of Honor back in those days was very different to the Medal of Honor today. It should be just pointed out. Unlike the earlier South Carolinas, the Florida was fast enough to be far more useful during the First World War, and she was assigned to Battleship Division 9, consisting of Florida, New York, Wyoming, and Delaware. This division departed for European waters on the 25th of April 1917 to join the Grand Fleet, where it was discovered by the British admirals that although they were bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, the gunnery of the American ships was worse than a Russian warship in the English Channel surrounded by fishing boats. Florida's lookouts would report seeing a U-boat during a convoy mission to Norway, but this was disputed by the crew of the Wyoming, and in general the fleet had very little to do other than sail around and bait the Germans out, which never happened. Right at the end of the war in late 1918, the Spanish flu would sweep through the Grand Fleet, and Florida was oddly the only American ship in the contingent to not be quarantined. When the war finally ended, Florida was part of the combined Royal Australian Navy, and French Navy contingents that rendezvoused with the surrendered High Seas Fleet on the 20th and took it into prison at Scapa Flow. In the post-war years, Florida would support the first transatlantic seaplane crossing by steaming to the Azores to take weather observations, and she would also participate in goodwill cruises to South America with Secretary of State Bainbridge Colbury aboard, conducting amphibious training exercises with Marine Corps in the Caribbean on the way. Florida would receive a large modernisation in the 20s, but due to the London Naval Treaty of 1930, she was removed from service on the 16th of February 1931 at the Philadelphia Navy Yard and sold for scrap. The ship's bell was, interestingly enough, saved and transported to the University of Florida in Gainesville, where it was eventually installed at Florida Field and traditionally rung after Gator football victories. Following the stadium's renovations, though, the bell was removed in 1992, and after the restoration it now resides in the lobby of the Museum of Florida History. Now, this is where things start to get interesting. The Utah. Utah was the second of the 2 Florida-class Dreadnought battleships and the first ship of the US Navy to bear the name of the state of Utah. She was built by the New York Shipbuilding Corporation and commissioned into the Navy on the 31st of August 1911. At first, she was essentially the same as Florida, so I won't really go into the details here again because, well, you just heard them. But this will change. After commissioning, Utah conducted her shakedown cruise along the Atlantic seaboard and the Caribbean before joining the fleet in March 1912. After some training cruises, the Utah would undertake a goodwill cruise to European waters in late 1913 with a brief stopover in France. In early 1914, while en route to Mexico, Utah intercepted the German-flagged steamer SS Ypiranga, which was carrying arms to the Mexican dictator Victoriano Huerta. Like I mentioned before, Utah and her sister ship Florida were the first American vessels on the scene, and she landed Marines to seize the city. Utah remained off Veracruz for 2 months before returning to New York for an overhaul and resuming her North Atlantic Fleet duties. When the US entered the First World War, Utah's wartime role was significantly different from her sister Florida. She didn't join the Grand Fleet in the North Sea, rather she spent much of the war closer to home, being stationed in the Chesapeake Bay area to train engine room personnel and gunners for the expanding fleet, until August 1918 when she departed for Bantry Bay Island with Vice Admiral Henry T. Mayo, Commander-in-Chief of the Atlantic Fleet, aboard. Upon arriving, she was assigned as the flagship of Battleship Division 6, commanded by Rear Admiral Thomas S. Rogers, and this division included the battleships Nevada and Oklahoma. It was tasked with covering convoys in the western approaches against possible attack from German surface raiders, although none would ever come. After the armistice, the Utah, along with Florida, would escort the ocean liner George Washington, carrying US President Woodrow Wilson to Brest for the negotiations at Versailles, and in the interwar years she would serve as a diplomatic vessel on multiple occasions, including essentially as a presidential yacht for President Hoover. Between these diplomatic missions, Utah received a significant modernization, including a replacement of her coal-fired boilers with oil-fired White Forster models taken from battleships scrapped under the Washington Naval Treaty, and her dodgy cage mast was replaced, and she even got facilities for a float plane. Unlike the Florida, though, she still had a future, and according to the terms of the London Naval Treaty of 1930, Utah was actually converted to a radio-controlled target ship to replace the old USS North Dakota. In July 1931, she was redesignated AG-16, and all of her primary and secondary weapons were removed. Weirdly, though, the turrets were left, mounted, which made her look strange as hell, almost like she had sheds on her deck. Work was completed by April 1st, 1932, when she was recommissioned, and she passed radio control trials in May 1932. And she spent the next 9 years absorbing punishment as a training vessel while also developing her secondary role of training anti-aircraft gunners. Utah would continue this duty over in the Pacific, where on the morning of December 7th, 1941, she was moored at the berth F-11 off Ford Island in Pearl Harbor, having recently completed another round of anti-aircraft gunnery drills. During the attack, 16 Nakajima B-5 and N-2 torpedo bombers from the carriers Soryu and Hiryu flew over Pearl City, approaching the west of Ford Island. The torpedo bombers were looking for the American aircraft carriers, which were usually anchored where Utah was moored that morning. Initially, the flight leaders identified Utah and rejected her as a target, deciding to attack elsewhere, but 6 B-5Ns from Soryu, led by Lieutenant Nakajima Tatsumi, broke off to attack the Utah, and this is largely due to the fact that the shapes over her barbettes at a cursory glance looked like turrets, giving the illusion that she was a battleship that was kind of out of place. 6 torpedoes were launched, 2 struck the Utah, while another missed and hit the cruiser Raleigh. At 8:12, Utah rolled over onto her port side and trapped a significant number of men within her hull. The ship's captain would make his way ashore and call for volunteers to assist the men. He was able to secure a cutting torch from the badly damaged cruiser Raleigh, and in total the crew was able to rescue just 4 men from the hull, with 58 officers and men being killed during the attack. Thankfully, though, 461 would end up surviving. Unlike the ships on Battleship Row, Utah was less of a priority to salvage, and after the initial effort to recover her failed, she was largely abandoned, left rolled over 38 degrees from horizontal on the bottom. Unlike the battleships of Battleship Row, she really had no military value worth recovering, and she was left where she lay. This means that the men killed when Utah was sunk were never actually removed from the wreck, and as such today she is considered a war grave. Utah would be formally decommissioned in September 1944 and stricken from the Naval Register in November of that year. In 1972, a monument was erected just off Ford Island near the sunken wreck, now part of the Pearl Harbor National Memorial, and it consists of a 70-foot walkway of white concrete extending from Ford Island to a platform in front of the ship, where a brass plaque and flagpole are located. The memorial, though, is sadly only accessible to individuals with military identification, and a colour guard does stand watch over the wreck, so even if you wanted to go and see the wreck, unfortunately that's just not possible. In 1989, Utah was added to the National Historic Landmark Registry, and relics have since been taken from the ship to be preserved in the Utah State Capitol building, including pieces from the ship's silverware and the captain's clock. The ship's bell, meanwhile, is on display at the Naval Science Building at the University of Utah, and as of 2024, 17 former crewmen who were aboard the ship at the time of her sinking have had their ashes interned within the wreck. Continuing on with dreadnoughts with really interesting post-dreadnought careers lands us with the USS Wyoming, the lead ship of her class of dreadnought battleships and the third US Navy vessel to carry the name. Interestingly though, I found out in my research that she's actually the third USS Wyoming, but only the second named after the state of Wyoming, because the first Wyoming was named after Wyoming Valley in Pennsylvania. Take a shot every time I say Wyoming. The battleship was laid down at the William Cramp & Sons shipyard in Philadelphia in February 1910, launched in May 1911, and completed in September 1912. She clocked in at 26,000 long tons as designed, and was 562 feet or 171 meters long. The Wyoming was powered by 4 shaft Parsons steam turbines and 12 coal-fired Babcock and Wilcox boilers, which generated a top speed of 20.5 knots, and a cruising range of about 8,000 nautical miles at 10 knots. Her main battery consisted of 12 12-inch guns arranged in 6 twin turrets on the centerline, with 2 super-firing pairs aft, giving her and her sister Arkansas a really unique side profile. Her armoured belt ran up to 11 inches thick, with her turret faces being about 12 inches. In short, as built, the Wyomings were incredibly powerful battleships, and just another example of iterative improvements over previous classes. After commissioning, she became the flagship of Rear Admiral Charles J. Badger, the commander of the Atlantic Fleet, and set off for a Caribbean cruise in January 1913, visiting the Panama Canal and participating in fleet exercises off Cuba. She also conducted a goodwill cruise to Europe, visiting the Mediterranean, and ferried troops during the US occupation of Veracruz during the Mexican Revolution of 1914. When the United States formally entered World War I in April 1917, Wyoming operated out of the Chesapeake Bay area for 7 months, mostly undertaking training cruises for newly enlisted sailors. That November, she was assigned to Battleship Division 9, which included Wyoming, New York, Delaware, and Florida, and she departed for Britain to join the Grand Fleet at Scapa Flow. By this point, you know what happened here: a whole lot of nothing but convoy escorts and sweeps. On the 6th of February 1918, Wyoming and her consorts escorted a convoy to Stavanger in Norway, accompanied by 8 British destroyers. The crew would actually weirdly report a torpedo attack from a German submarine, but this was a case of nervous crewmen reporting something that wasn't there. They were green and new to submarine threats, so this kind of false reporting is not at all shocking, nor should they really be mocked for it, considering, how on edge everyone was. Wyoming, like the rest of the Grand Fleet, would be there for the surrender of the German High Seas Fleet, and she would escort Woodrow Wilson to France for negotiations. The post-war years would keep the ship busy, with Wyoming serving in both the Atlantic and Pacific fleets, where she would also pay a visit to Chile and be reviewed by President Arturo Alessandro Palma, before returning to the Atlantic to resume the familiar rhythm of winter Caribbean exercises and summer training cruises. Notably, in late 1926, she received a new executive officer, a one William F. Halsey Jr., who would stay on board until 1927. Like every other ship that we are covering here, politics now got in the way, and under the terms of the London Naval Treaty of 1930, Wyoming was to be demilitarized. During the process, her anti-torpedo bulges were removed, her side armor was taken off, and half her main battery guns were also removed. She was reclassified as AG-17 and given the role as training vessel, similar to the Utah. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor, the ship would become vital for the US Navy, though, particularly when it came to training anti-aircraft gunners. She would operate primarily in the safe waters of the Chesapeake Bay, where she earned the name Chesapeake Raider from the locals. Wyoming would train thousands of anti-aircraft gunners on weapons ranging from light 50 caliber machine guns to medium caliber 5-inch guns, and it's from this time that we get these interesting photos of a battleship with little destroyer guns. In 1944, she was updated at the Norfolk Navy Yard, with her remaining 12-inch turrets removed and replaced entirely with modern dual-purpose 5-inch mounts, along with lighter anti-aircraft weapons, with the intention to replicate the exact conditions that her students would encounter aboard larger fleet vessels. Over the course of the war, Wyoming would train an estimated 35,000 gunners on 7 different types of weapons, and due to her extensive use, she has the distinction of firing more ammunition than any other ship during the fleet during the war. What's funny about the Wyoming is that never once did she fire in anger in her entire career over both wars. So she fired the most, without ever firing in anger. It's just one of those little quirks. After Germany's defeat, Wyoming was assigned to experimental work, where she joined Composite Task Force 69, nice, under Vice Admiral Willis A. Lee. She was then tasked with developing tactics to more effectively engage Japanese kamikazes, conducting experimental gunnery drills with towed sleeves, drone aircraft, and radio-controlled targets. Wyoming's final cruise would be in 1946, training another slew of intakes. Among them was a completely unknown ensign by the name of Jimmy Carter, who you may have since heard of, and the battleship was finally decommissioned on the 1st of August 1947 and scrapped that October. She saw no action, but without her, the US simply would not have had the sailors to win the war, so in a way, she outlived and exceeded her intended purpose, and she's also really interesting and cool, hence all the photos you've seen, which make her, look a bit odd, to say the least. The Arkansas was the second member of the Wyoming class, and unlike her sister, she is far more accurate on world warships. She has also had a much more violent career in real life. Built by the New York Shipbuilding Corporation, she was laid down in January 1910, launched in January 1911, and commissioned into the Navy in September 1912. Her stats as built are the same as Wyoming, so we'll skip over them and get into her career. Following her commissioning, Arkansas participated in a fleet review for President Taft before taking on a voyage to Panama to inspect the still unfinished canal. During the same shakedown cruise, the Navy's first long-distance continuous wave wireless telegraphy system was successfully tested, with transmissions received by Arkansas from a prototype transmission facility in Arlington, Virginia. In early 1914, like basically every other dreadnought I have covered, Arkansas sailed to Mexico to participate in the occupation of Veracruz, and in her case she contributed 4 companies of naval infantry, some 17 officers and 313 enlisted men, who fought their way through the city until it was secured, with 2 receiving the Medal of Honor. When the United States declared war on Germany in April 1917, Arkansas was assigned to Battleship Division 7 in Virginia, where she patrolled the East Coast and trained gun crews for the next 14 months. She was sent to Britain in July 1918 to relieve the battleship Delaware, which had been operating with the Grand Fleet, and she would arrive on the 28th of July, where she joined up with the rest of Battleship Division 9 as a part of the 6th Battle Squadron of the Grand Fleet. You know exactly what happened in the North Sea by now, and the Arkansas headed home after the war. The ship would be modernized at the Philadelphia Naval Yard, with her 12 old coal-fired boilers being replaced with 4 oil-fired models, and anti-torpedo bulges were added, along with deck armor being strengthened, and a catapult actually being installed on No. 3 turret amidships to operate float planes. Throughout the 1920s and the 30s, she carried midshipmen from the United States Naval Academy on summer training cruises, visiting ports across Europe, the Caribbean, and the Pacific, and she even responded to a domestic emergency on the 30th of June 1925, where she stopped in Santa Barbara, California, to assist in the aftermath of a major earthquake, sending detachments ashore to police and set up a radio station within the city to organize help. Following the outbreak of World War II in September 1939, Arkansas was assigned to neutrality patrols in the Atlantic, and after the United States entered the war following the attack on Pearl Harbor, she was extensively refitted with 36 Bofors 40mm anti-aircraft guns, 26 Oerlikon 20mm, and many, many more other small arms. She would then spend much of 1942 and 43 escorting convoys across the Atlantic and North Africa, before being assigned to the invasion fleet as part of the D-Day landings. On the mornings of D-Day, Arkansas took up position off the coast of Omaha Beach, and at 5:52 a.m. her guns fired in anger for the first time in her career, bombarding the German positions around Omaha for over a week, before shifting to support ground forces further along the coast. On the 25th of June, Arkansas bombarded Cherbourg in support of American forces during their attack on the city, and during this bombardment, German coastal guns would actually straddle the vessel but score no hits. That summer, she then sailed to the Mediterranean to support the landings in southern France called Operation Dragoon, providing gunfire support to the amphibious operation from the 15th of August. With the naval war in Europe now well and truly over, the old Arkansas transferred straight away to the Pacific in early 1945, and on the 16th of February she dropped anchor off Iwo Jima and opened fire in Japanese positions on the island's west coast, with the bombardment for lasting for 3 days. She then pressed on to the largest amphibious operation of the Pacific War, arriving off Okinawa on the 25th of March, where she continued to provide gunfire support for 46 days while being under kamikaze attack. After ferrying troops home as part of Operation Magic Carpet, Arkansas was given a far more interesting end than any other ship we've spoken about thus far. She was assigned for disposal as part of Operation Crossroads, aka the nuclear test at Bikini Atoll. On the 1st of July, she survived the first test with extensive shock damage to her upper works, but her hull was largely intact. 3 weeks later, on the 25th of July, a second underwater detonation, codenamed Baker, essentially under the ship, would send the Arkansas vertical and capsize her. The ship was officially decommissioned 4 days later, before being struck from the Naval Register in mid-August, and she now lies inverted at the bottom of the Bikini Lagoon, where she serves as an artificial reef. I have to say, Viking funeral, far better end than the blowtorch. Just far better end.
So, despite the Delawares, Wyomings, and Floridas rapidly coming online, the American Navy didn't give 2 shreds of a fluff, and wanted more DACA. The way the American military-industrial complex worked is that they would whip themselves into a frenzy over what other countries were doing and then screamed at Congress until they got what they wanted. In this instance, the fear was increasing battleship gun size. The Brit Bongs were strapping 13.5s to the Orions, and the rest of the world was adopting 12-inch guns, and the fear was that they would be left behind. So, planners knocked their skulls together and come up with a plan. 14-inch guns. Genius. In our modern world, a consultancy firm would be paid $4.5 million to come up with that. In 1909, with the knowledge that the Floridas and Wyomings would need to be augmented by something with a little more oomph, the General Board took some plans for what were essentially super Wyomings off the shelf, messed around with some things to meet budget restraints, and produced the New York class. The first battleships in the world to be armed with 14-inch guns, and the first American super dreadnoughts. However, apart from their big guns, the New Yorks were kinda not great. at least at the outset. They were designed with coal engines at a time when naval technology was moving towards oil. They still had the 5 double turret layout, which is horrendously inefficient with the power of hindsight, because what is this middle turret even doing? They had 0 AA armament, and no provisions in place to even consider adding one, and their armor scheme would be rendered almost immediately obsolete by the advent of more advanced range-finding technology, allowing ships to hit shots from way further than anticipated. It's the reality of arms race ship construction, I suppose, but these deficiencies would require multiple very expensive overhauls during the ship's lifespan. That said, the 14-inch guns were very, very good at that point, so they were still going to be very valuable, assuming they got them out before other countries caught on. With this all in mind, the lead ship of the New York class was the USS Texas. She was laid down first, just roll with it. Finally, after all these ships, we get a battleship that actually does something interesting. Little Miss Lone Star would be laid down on April 17th of 1911 at Newport News in Virginia. She would be launched in May of 1912 and would be completed and commissioned into the U.S. Navy in March of 1914. She would clock in at 28,822 tons fully loaded, she could make a reasonable 21 knots, and carried 10 14-inch guns and also 4 torpedo tubes. Her life started with a bang. She got no shakedown cruise and was instead immediately thrown into action in Mexico for the Battle of Veracruz in May because Texas don't care. She spent the rest of 1914 and early 1915 sailing between New York and Mexico for repairs and action, and after things had died down, she resumed the standard issue nothing during peacetime. In 1916, already showing the flaws of her design, she was given her first refit, which included shoving AA guns onto a ship never designed for them, because Texas don't care, and also saw her given a more advanced range-finding system. When World War I started, she mostly served in a gun training role, save for that one time in September of 1917 when she ran into Block Island, the landmass, but thankfully she didn't sink because the ship had managed to basically park herself on the beach. Her captain had made an oopsie and had the ship turned at the wrong time trying to avoid a minefield. Block Island won this particular engagement, obliterating her hull and requiring extensive repairs after she was wrenched free by an army of tugboats. Her repairs were finished by January of 1918, after which she sailed across the Atlantic to join the Grand Fleet in Scapa Flow. From here, her World War I was convoy escorts and nothing else because the germs were hiding, until the war ended and she got to partake in the surrender of the High Seas Fleet. Neat. The interwar period saw Texas engage in a lot of experimentation, especially with naval aircraft. She was the ship used to test the efficacy of both float planes on warships and using those float planes as spotters. In 1924, she got to blow up the Colorado-class battleship Washington, who we'll get to, and then in 1925 she would be dry docked for her second refit, this one being way bigger. Finally replacing her terrible coal boilers with much more efficient oil ones, upgrading her masts and fire control, giving her torpedo bulges, and bumping her AA suite from 2 guns to 8. Oh, and they got rid of the torps. No demo run for you. She spent the rest of the interwar sailing around, exercising, and escorting the occasional U.S. diplomatic mission. She was overhauled twice more. In 1937, her AA was bumped to 40 guns, and in 1938, she was given experimental fire control radar, which was later upgraded to a better system in 1941. She was the flagship of the Atlantic Fleet when the U.S. entered the Second Great War in December of 1941. Through the course of the war, her AA armament would be bumped to 94 guns of varying sizes because of Pearl Harbor, which is understandable. She escorted convoys until Operation Torch in late 1942, when it was determined that the by this point very old lady could still blow things up because Texas don't care about things like torpedo bombers and submarines. She partook in the operations in northern Morocco, and she would be the ship to broadcast Ike's declaration of "Get out of our way or we will move you" in the preceding hours. She didn't do very much because the army was being the army, but she did blow up a few bunkers and coastal forts, so it wasn't really a complete waste of a trip. After this, she escorted convoys until Operation Neptune in June of 1944, where she was assigned to bombard German positions around Omaha Beach. Ever the overachiever, the Texas set a naval record by firing 255 shells in 34 minutes during the opening bombardment. Reminder that these are 14-inch shells. They cause some damage. She would fire several hundred more over the next few days of fighting, in some instances sailing right up to the beach itself to point-blank sniper nests. At one point, her captain said, "Now watch this drive," and ordered half the ship flooded to give the guns a better firing angle after the fighting advanced outside of her regular range. She was kicking bubblegum, that's for sure. She returned to the UK on June 18th, loaded up on more shells, and joined with Arkansas and Nevada to go blow up Cherbourg on June 25th. During this engagement, she was smashed with a shell from a German coastal battery, wounding 10 and killing 1, and she was hit with another that didn't explode. But because Texas don't care, the rain of fire continued and she managed to get her revenge, hitting one of the guns directly and blowing the germs into the stratosphere. After repairs, in July, she went down to help out with Dragoon, which saw her blow up a bunch of beaches and vineyards since the germs had run away, and then she was reassigned to the Pacific. She provided fire fire support at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, firing 4,600 shells and shooting down at least one kamikaze plane and wounding several more. When the war ended, she finally got a second to breathe, helping repatriate American troops before being placed in reserve in June of 1946. Instead of being scrapped like most of these ships will be, her life was actually spared by virtue of the Battleship Texas Commission, an organization that sought to preserve the ship and her history. They would tow her to Houston and set her up as a museum ship. Despite this, funding was always an issue, and her aging structure began to gradually wither away in the following decades, with many leaks in her hull threatening to sink the ship outright. In 1983, she was turned over to the Parks and Wildlife Department, who took the preservation of the ship more seriously. They collected $15 million in donations and dry docked her in 1988, giving her a complete refurbishment, replacing a massive amount of her hull and deck, and rebuilding her interior to the 1945 standard. They also gave her period-accurate armament, since many of her light guns and AA had been cannibalized for other ships. She reopened in 1990, but by 2004 she was struggling once again because of industrial waste polluting rivers and corroding her hull. It was then planned to dry berth her with the help of the non-profit Battleship Texas Foundation, but because of funding issues, this would never end up manifesting. She started to leak very severely throughout the 2010s, and she nearly sank in place several times, eventually leading to the decision by the Parks Department to turn her over to the Foundation to dock her again for more repairs. After a massive round of fundraising and some grants from various levels of government, in 2022 the repair process began, which continues to this day. She left dry dock in 2024 and was set up in Galveston, where refurbishment work is still being undertaken. Her 114th launch anniversary was a few weeks ago, making her one of the oldest floating ships on Earth, and there are plans for the ship to be fully reopened to the public in the next year or so. They have a YouTube channel showing their progress, and it's genuinely so cool that ships like Texas still exist. She continues to endure and will hopefully endure long into the future. USS New York was the second and name ship of the New York class. New York's stat line at game start was identical to Texas, and she would be laid down on September 11th of 1911, launched in October of 1912, and would be completed and commissioned into the fleet on May 15th of 1914. Like Texas, she was immediately shipped off to Veracruz before doing the standard peacetime stuff until World War I. Of note was that every year she would host a Christmas party for orphans and underprivileged people at the behest of the crew. She was the people's battleship, that's for sure. She was sent off to Scapa Flow in late 1917 to join with the Brits, where she primarily escorted stuff. However, she does get kinda credit for hitting something that may or may not have been a German submarine and presumably sinking it in October of 1918, completely on accident. The collision beat her up and she had to be dry docked for the rest of the war, but she did make the trip to see the surrender of the High Seas Fleet. Her and Texas then had a functionally identical interwar experience, lots of exercising, diplomatic trips, and sailing around. And in 1926 she would be given the same refit that Texas got to bring her up to modern standards. This would be completed by 1928, after which she was sent to the Pacific, where she did more exercising for the next decade. She also served as the U.S. Navy representative to the Coronation Fleet Review of King George VI. And in 1938, she became the second ship in the U.S. Navy to be given a radar set, the experimental XAF, which is neat. After World War II started, she was sent to the Atlantic to engage in neutrality patrols and also invade Iceland for a side quest. In late 1941, she was docked for a refit just in time for Japan to bomb Pearl Harbor, so this was sped up so she could be crashed back into service because they suddenly needed more battleships. She spent the next year running convoys until she joined her sister for Operation Torch, although at a different landing point, where she shelled French positions and destroyed shore artillery. However, after this, she spent 1943 to late 1944 as an escort and training ship. This made the crew kind of annoyed since they wanted to be, actually fighting the World War, so eventually in late 1944 she was reassigned to the Pacific for the final push against Japan. She sailed with Texas and some other ships to go destroy Iwo Jima, where New York would score a hit on the island's main ammo dump, effectively nuking the island. After this, she went to Okinawa, firing 4,000 shells in 76 days and effectively melting her barrels to the point that she needed to be withdrawn for repairs. She also had a near miss with a kamikaze plane. When the war ended, she sailed repatriation missions for several months before, in early 1946, she was selected for Operation Crossroads. Essentially, the Americans decided to blow up ships with nuclear weapons to see what would happen. Being a warship that couldn't say no, she essentially went, "Send me out," with a bang. And in July of 1946, with a bang, she went out. Kinda. Actually, she shrugged off 2 nuclear bombs, the first airdropped and the second underwater. The New York class were tough, what can I say? Dissatisfied with the fact that she wasn't dead, she was towed to Hawaii to be studied for 2 years before, on July 6 of 1948, she was towed out to sea and shot at by ships and aircraft for target practice. But of course, a ship that shrugs off 2 nuclear bombs isn't gonna go quietly. She, allegedly, took 41 bombs, 56 rockets, 20 16-inch shells, and half a dozen torpedoes to finally go down. Defiant to the end, the old girl's wreck has never been found. Absolute mad lass. So, by 1910, Congress was starting to get a little bit upset over just how much money the Navy was voring, and proposals for increasingly large ships were getting shot down left and right. However, we must all remember the mantra: another trillion credits to Kuwait drive yards. So President Taft managed to sneak 2 battleships past Congress for the fiscal year 1912. The design for these ships went through many iterations, but after some haggling and telling the Bureau of Construction and Repair to go die, the ships that came to be known as the Nevada class would be settled on in late 1912. The first of what are referred to as the standard type battleships. They were to essentially be better New Yorks, featuring oil-fired boilers from the get-go, the same armament of 10 guns but in 4 turrets instead of 5, modern rangefinders and fire controls, and a smaller superstructure. Their armor was also better designed, being the first ships in the world to feature the all-or-nothing armor scheme, which essentially loaded up armor on the important parts of the ship, like the magazines, engines, and citadel, and had basically nothing on the other parts. This was smart, because what point is there to having armor on pieces of the ship that have nothing of relevance anyway, and it also saved a ton of weight. The Nevadas would also be the first American ships to have triple turrets, the first to have single funnels, and the first to be fully oil-driven as built. The only real funky thing was the fact that the guns were in 2 triple and 2 double turrets, which is fine, but looks funny, so it's a ding against them, obviously. The class came to displace 28,900 tons fully loaded, could make 20.5 knots, and carried 10 14-inch guns. All of this for essentially the same weight meant that they were basically just better New Yorks, despite the fact that the New Yorks had not even hit the water yet. The name and lead ship of the class was the USS Nevada, go figure. She was laid down on November 4th of 1912 and would be launched in July of 1914, and would be completed and commissioned in March of 1916. She would technically partake in World War I, but she didn't make the trip across the pond until August of 1918, being assigned to a small division operating out of Bantry Bay in County Cork, escorting convoys in the western approaches. She never once engaged an enemy, so she was chilling. During the interwar, she continued to do a whole lot of very little, mostly exercising and sailing around for diplomatic missions, which included celebrating Brazilian Independence Day in 1922. In 1927, she was docked for a refit, which included replacing her masts, giving her new geared turbines, giving her torpedo bulges, replacing her boilers, retrofitting her guns to have better firing arcs, giving her catapults to hold spotting aircraft, and rebuilding large parts of the superstructure. These were completed by January of 1930, and she was shipped off to the Pacific, where she lived a chill life until December 7th of 1941. Get ready, folks, because Nevada is the next of the Tears of Pearl. Nevada was at the front of Battleship Row, with Arizona right behind her. Because she wasn't next to another battleship, she could actually maneuver, and all things considered, she got quite lucky. Her officer of the deck was in charge since the captain was on shore, and he had ordered an extra boiler turned on earlier in the morning for a routine engine rotation. This meant that when the attack began, she was able to get moving pretty quickly, and most of the ship's party was up and about and was able to react quickly. Furthermore, she was in the middle of having her ammunition replaced, so all of her magazines were empty, effectively preventing a potentially catastrophic explosion. Before she broke from formation, she was struck by a torpedo from a Kate bomber, but her damage control party was on point and she remained upright. She swung around and attempted to make a break for the open sea where there was greater maneuverability, in the process of which being attacked by the second wave of Japanese dive bombers, who attempted to sink her in the harbor to block it. She would be hit by between 6 and 10 bombs in various places, one destroying the gasoline tank and setting the ship on fire. DCP did its best, but once it was clear that the ship was likely screwed, she grounded herself to prevent sinking in deep water. She suffered 60 dead and 109 wounded, but her crews managed to shoot down 7 planes. Due to her position, she was actually entirely savable and was refloated in February of 1942 to be salvaged and fixed up. This included a refit, completed in October of 1942, which brought her displacement to around 30,500 tons and massively bumped her AA armament. She was then sent to the Atlantic, escorting convoys for a year and a bit before partaking in the D-Day landings in June of 1944, shelling German positions all along the Normandy coast. In August, she was sent down with Texas to support Dragoon, in the process getting into a knife fight with a coastal fort that was armed with battleship guns. She was told to remove that direction, so she fired literally thousands of shells at the fort and removed it. After this, she was sent back stateside to have her barrels replaced, which included her having her front turret guns replaced by those salvaged from the Arizona, who we will get to. Nevada carried the Spirit of Arizona with her to Iwo Jima and Okinawa, using those guns to shell the islands into oblivion. The only major thing of note was her getting smashed with a kamikaze plane the night of March 24th, 1945, killing 11 and knocking out one of her turrets. This was basically the end of the Second World War for her. After the war, it was determined that she was too old to be worth keeping around, so in 1946 she was assigned to Operation Crossroads. Nevada was actually the main target ship for the first test on July 1st, painted a bright orange so that the bombers couldn't possibly, and they missed. How do you miss with a nuclear weapon. Nevada endured as a result, and she would go on to survive the second nuke as well, although she was covered in radioactive seawater and therefore unusable. She was towed to Pearl Harbor, studied for a while, and then, much like New York, was towed out to sea on July 31st of 1948 and shot at by the USS Iowa, which failed to sink her. These dreadnoughts, man, built different. Who even needs 16-inch guns anyway? After this, she was smashed with torpedoes, which finally sent her below the waves. Her wreck would be rediscovered in 2020, but she's 4,700 meters down, which is deeper than the Titanic for reference, so the wreck has largely been left alone. Oklahoma is the more tragic of the Nevada class. She had an identical stat line to her sister, so I won't repeat myself, and she would be laid down on October 26 of 1912. I am just now realizing she was laid down before Nevada. I'm not going back and changing that. She would be launched in March of 1914 and would be completed and commissioned into the Navy in May of 1916, with the only notable thing during her construction being her catching fire one time. She was Kuznetsov maxing, it's fine. She did basically nothing until August of 1918 when she joined with her sister to go to Ireland, escorting convoys and basically just chilling, save for one time when her crew got into a brawl with, inexplicably, members of the Irish Republican organization Sinn Féin, which is really funny. After the war ended, she did the standard peacetime training and diplomatic missions until November 1927, when she was given a major refit that was, again, basically identical to her sister to bring her up to speed. This was completed by mid-1929, and she rejoined the fleet to once again just do exercises for a decade. This was only interrupted by taking a quick jaunt to Spain to pick up some refugees and American citizens who were stuck in the country after it exploded. Beginning in 1937, she was assigned to the Pacific Fleet operating out of Pearl Harbor, where she remained until the fateful day in December. Oklahoma was at the back of the main concentration of Battleship Row, on the outward side next to Maryland, directly in line with this channel, which meant that she was in the flight path of basically the entire Japanese torpedo force. As such, she got hammered. Mere minutes after the attack began, she was struck with 3 airdrop torpedoes in close proximity to each other, tearing a gash in her hull and causing her to hemorrhage fuel and oil into the harbor. A few minutes after the 3rd torpedo hit, she was hit with 2 more, leading to a call to abandon ship as the battleship began listing heavily. It's possible that she was struck 3 more times before capsizing a mere 12 minutes after the first torpedo hit. Unlike the Nevada, her crew was not in a state of readiness, so the AA guns were all locked down and she was largely unable to fight back. However, her position absorbing basically the entire torpedo attack likely saved the Maryland from a similar fate, and many of Oklahoma's sailors made their way to that ship to man their AA guns to continue the fight. 429 men went down with her, many of whom suffocated or drowned before rescuers could find them due to leaking vapors making cutting through her hull a dangerous prospect. Because she sank in relatively shallow water, the call was made to raise her and salvage what they could in the months that followed. Work began in July of 1942 and took an entire year to pull off, since flipping a 30,000-ton warship is not exactly easy. She was declared a total constructive loss and was stripped of her armament, remaining stores, and anything valuable, and was formally decommissioned in September of 1944. Her superstructure was removed and she was auctioned off for scrap. In early May of 1947, 2 tugs began to pull her hulk towards her final scrapping location in California, but on May 17th, the group encountered a severe storm. Oklahoma had determined that the only true send-off for a warship was to rejoin with the beloved sea where she belonged. She started taking on water, rolled in a wave just the right way, and then shot straight down. The 2 tugs were nearly dragged into the sea with her, being yanked backwards at 15 knots, which is absolutely terrifying, but some quick thinking saw both cables cut just in time to spare the 2 ships. For one of them, their cable actually got jammed, only releasing literally seconds before the ship was dragged to its grave. I swear, if I were on one of those tugboats, I think I would have legitimately passed out. You would not catch me within 100 kilometers of the ocean ever again, because clearly Poseidon is real and he hates you specifically. Oklahoma disappeared into the depths and has never been seen again, as her wreck has not been found. Bits and pieces of the ship are preserved at various museums, including aboard the USS Missouri, which is moored where the fated ship once stood. A memorial for the men who went down with her stands within the Pearl Harbor National Memorial.
Now, I should be honest here. This bit should be the Pennsylvanias, but when Spartan and I split the ships, he wanted to do both those of the New Yorks, and I really wanted to do the New Mexicos. So to spread it out a bit, I've put the New Mexicos here, ahead of the Pennsylvanias, even though the Pennsylvanias came first. It's not that deep. I just liked the New Mexicos, and he liked the Pennsylvanias, so this is where we went. New Mexico's keel was laid down on the 14th of October 1915 at the New York Navy Yard. She was launched in April 1917 and commissioned into the fleet in May 1918. As with every other class of ship, we will go through the stats of New Mexico first, And just know that the three sisters were all essentially the same as they were built at the start of their careers. The New Mexico class were really a turning point in the standards of the day with their construction, and they are awesome in every sense of the word. The absolute pinnacle of congressionally restricted American naval construction. New Mexico was the US Navy's most advanced warship and its first battleship with turboelectric transmission at the time of completion, which helped her reach a maximum speed of 21 knots. She measured 624 feet in length, displaced 32,000 tons at normal load, and carried a crew of over 1,000 officers and men. Her main battery consisted of 12 14-inch guns arranged in 4 triple turrets, and something special about these guns was that for the first time in American battleship construction, each barrel could actually elevate independently. The ship's belt was up to 13.5 inches thick, and the turret faces were plated with 18 inches of steel. Long story short, the ship was a bit stubby, but was armed to the absolute teeth, and it's basically a case of 3 floating, screaming Texas Reds with big irons on their hips. New Mexico's first major assignment was to escort the ship that carried President Woodrow Wilson to the Versailles Peace Conference, which, yes, that little squadron, if you haven't picked it yet, was extremely heavily armed. On her voyage back across the Atlantic, she encountered a schooner that was slowly sinking, and after taking the survivors off, the crew decided to blow the ship up for target practice. Which, I mean, I get it, but, seems a bit rude to the captain of the schooner. In July 1919, she was designated the flagship of the newly established Pacific Fleet, and she transited the Panama Canal before arriving in San Pedro, California in August. The interwar years were quite productive, with the New Mexico serving on repeated exercises and maneuvers both off the Pacific and Atlantic coast, and she took part in cruises to South American ports. Interestingly, during this period, she tested PID controllers, and these are automatic steering devices invented by the engineer Nicholas Minorski that have since become commonplace in ship manufacture. In 1925, she made a goodwill cruise to Australia and New Zealand and won gunnery awards for engineering and battlefield efficiency. From March 31 to January 33, she underwent a major overhaul and modernization at Philadelphia, where she received 8 5-inch 25 caliber anti-aircraft guns and other upgrades. It was now 1936, and the powers of the US Navy made a discovery that the 21-knot top speed, which Congress refused to change through funding limitations for years, was becoming a bit of a problem, and it was slow compared to Japan's slowest battleships. Shocking, right? Nobody saw this coming, and the Navy definitely didn't point this out 1,000 times. Either way, this would now trigger the design process for the North Carolinas, which we won't be covering, but they are the best-looking American battleships of World War II, do not at me. As tensions with Japan mounted, New Mexico was based at Pearl Harbor in late 1940, but when the war triggered off in Europe for the Americans, she was transferred to the Atlantic for neutrality patrols beginning in mid-1941. This would fortunately save her from Pearl Harbor, but on the 10th of December, while headed towards Hampton Roads en route to the west coast, she would accidentally ram and sink the American freighter Oregon just south of the Nantucket Lightship. New Mexico reached the Pacific in early 1942 and immediately began earning her battle stars, participating in shore bombardments during the Attu and Kiska campaigns in the Aleutian Islands, at Tarawa, through the Marshall Islands, through the Mariana and Palau campaigns, at Makin Atoll during the Gilbert invasions in November 43, and she just kept shelling positions away while guarding troop transports at night and providing anti-aircraft cover for their operations. In 1944, her guns fell on Kwajalein, Ibai and the Marshalls, then on Tinian, Saipan and Guam. Odds are, if you were a Japanese soldier on a Pacific atoll, New Mexico was probably shooting at you. During the Philippine campaign, as the ship bombarded Lingayen Gulf on the 6th of January 1945, she came under kamikaze attack. One would actually strike her bridge, killing her commanding officer, Captain Fleming, along with 29 others. Among the dead was Lieutenant General Herbert Lumsden, the British representative to the Douglas MacArthur, and this was the most senior British Army combat fatality of World War II. A further 87 crew would be wounded, and the ship was forced to retire for repairs. Repairs would be completed at Pearl Harbor, at which New Mexico would sail to Ulithi Atoll to join Task Force 54 as part of the fire support group for the invasion of Okinawa. Her guns opened up on Okinawa on the 26th of March, and for the next month she continued supporting American troops ashore, and on the 11th of May she actually engaged surface targets, which were torpedo boats. The kamikazes found her again just after sunset on the 12th of May, though, when the battleship was hit by 2 planes. One of these hit the ship directly, and another hit with a bomb. The fires were extinguished in 30 minutes, but 54 crew were killed during the attack and a further 119 wounded. She withdrew again for repairs before returning to the fleet in preparation for Operation Downfall. News of the war's end, though, did reach New Mexico while she was at Saipan in August, and the battleship entered Tokyo Bay on the 28th, being present for Japan's formal surrender on the 2nd of September 1945. The New Mexico departed Tokyo Bay on the 6th of September, and she reached Boston a month later. Unlike her sister, which we will get into soon, she was decommissioned shortly after in July 1946, being struck from the register in 47 and being sold for scrap. The intention was initially to break up the ship in Newark, New Jersey, but city officials were in the middle of a $70 million waterfront beautification program, and they threw an absolute tantrum and said that they would block the ship's entry, sending 2 city fireboats out to use fire hoses and chemical sprayers to stop the battleship from being scrapped there. In response, the company responsible for the scrapping got together 4 tugs to press through the fireboat blockade, and they even got the Coast Guard to declare it would guarantee the battleship's safe passage. The whole fiasco was dubbed the Battle of Newark Bay, and it required Navy Department Under Secretary John Kenney to arrange a compromise. Newark would scrap the New Mexico and 2 other battleships, Idaho and Wyoming, but no permanent dismantling facility would be established, and the responsible party for the scrapping would only have 9 months to dispose of all 3 ships or face $1,000 a day in fines. New Mexico finally entered the Newark Channel in November, and she was scrapped on time, with 2 of her ship's bells being preserved and donated to the state of New Mexico. The larger of the 2 is now part of the New Mexico History Museum, located in Santa Fe, while the smaller bell hangs near Smith Plaza at the University of New Mexico in Albuquerque. She also has the distinction of having probably the hardest photo of any American warship ever taken of her, with the exception to one of Tennessee, which we will get into, which is this one here. Yes, that is Mount Fuji. I've stared at this photo for 50 minutes. It's amazing. Next up, we have the USS Mississippi, which, weirdly, for some reason, this tends to be one of the ships that sort of just gets forgotten from the US battle fleet in World War II. And for the life of me, I can't figure out why, but it always seems to just sort of get forgotten in my research. That in Idaho. No idea why. I think it's because this class wasn't at Pearl Harbor. She was the second of 3 New Mexico-class battleships and the 3rd US Navy ship to carry the name of the 20th state. Her keel was laid down in April 1915 at the Newport News Shipbuilding Company in Virginia, and she was launched in January 1917 before commissioning in December of that year. Like I said before, she's a carbon copy of New Mexico essentially at construction, so we'll skip all the technical bits. New Mexico arrived far too late to serve in the Great War in any meaningful capacity, spending her first months conducting training exercises in Cuban waters. The interwar decade saw the ship survive all the treaties due to how new she was and, well, just how powerful the class was compared to older ships. Interestingly, during these exercises, a spotter aircraft was used for the first time to help direct American battleship gunnery in a fleet exercise. Not everything would go smoothly, though, for Mississippi in the interwar years, because while conducting a gunnery practice off San Pedro on the 12th of June 1924, there was an explosion in the second turret that caused a fire and led to the deaths of 44 members of the crew. When the ship returned to port, the gunpowder remaining in the last gun in that turret actually exploded again, killing 4 more members of the rescue team, and sending the shell that was in the gun towards the passenger yacht liner Yale, but thankfully it missed. This, at the time, was the deadliest peacetime disaster in the US Navy's history. In early 1931, she returned to the East Coast for a major modernization at Norfolk Navy Yard, and her original turbines were replaced with the newly geared models by Westinghouse. She would then receive updated boilers that pushed her speed up to 22 knots, which was, compared to the other ships in the fleet, pretty good, but compared to other modern battleships being designed, rather glacial. Her firepower, in particular, her anti-aircraft firepower, was also improved, as was her range. When the war in Europe began, Mississippi and her 2 sister ships were transferred to the Atlantic Fleet, where she escorted convoys from Newport, Rhode Island, to Iceland and patrolled the North Atlantic waters as part of the neutrality patrols. 2 days after the Japanese attack, Mississippi departed Iceland bound for the Pacific, and she reached San Francisco in early January 1942, spending the following months training and escorting convoys along the west coast. Her first taste of combat would come in the Aleutian Islands campaign, where she bombarded Kiska in 1943, and during the Gilbert and Marshall Islands campaign in November 1943 off Macon, 43 men would be killed when, for the second time in her career, her second turret suffered an internal explosion. Due to the fact it was wartime, though, the turret in question was taken offline, and the remaining 3 continued to bombard Kwajalein, Tarawa, Watje, and Kavieng before the ship was finally headed back to the US for repairs. In October 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, Mississippi would become one of the few American battleships to actually engage an enemy battleship. The engagement in question was the Battle of the Surigao Strait, when American and Australian forces, centered around the old standard battleships, was able to ambush and destroy the Japanese Southern Force under Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura, sinking the battleships Fuso and Yamashiro. Due to her age, the ship was equipped with older fire control radars and struggled to pick out targets in the darkness, managing only to fire a single 12-gun salvo before the ceasefire was ordered. It was the last salvo in the battle that was fired, which incidentally means it was the last battleship to ever fire on another battleship in history. Not a bad little statistic to have there. During the bombardment off Luzon in 1945, a Japanese kamikaze struck the ship, though she remained on station until February, when she withdrew to Pearl Harbor for repairs. At Okinawa, she returned to duty and actually shelled Shuri Castle, inflicting heavy damage on key Japanese defensive strongpoints, before a second kamikaze hit her in June. She survived both strikes and was actually present in Tokyo Bay on the 2nd of September 1945 with surrender. Unlike every other standard battleship essentially, including her two sisters, Mississippi wasn't scrapped with the end of the war. She was actually converted to a gunnery training ship and assigned the hull number AG-128 in Feb 1946. After extensive reconstruction at the Norfolk Naval Shipyard, she served in the Operational Development Force, carried out gunnery tests and evaluating new weapon systems. She would survive into this role into the 50s, and during this time she was equipped with two RIM-2 Terrier missile launchers in 1952, which means that modern missiles, and aka the modern missile fleet, the modern American fleet was born on an old veteran Dreadnought, and that's honestly pretty damn cool. Mississippi was finally decommissioned on the 17th of September 1956 and sold to Bethlehem Steel for scrapping before being broken up in 1957. One of the 14-inch guns from the ship still remains and is actually preserved in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. The last of the New Mexico-class battleships was the Idaho. She was the fourth ship of the United States Navy to bear the name of the 43rd state, and she was built by the New York Shipbuilding Corporation in Camden, New Jersey. On a similar timeline to her sisters, she was laid down in January 1915, launched in June 1917, and commissioned in March 1919. Idaho missed the First World War completely, and she set sail in 1919 for her shakedown cruise to Guantanamo Bay, where things were relatively peaceful. For much of the following decade, Idaho conducted the routine business of peacetime naval service, and this included training exercises off the North and South American coasts, fleet reviews, and occasional ceremonial duties. In 1925, she took part in major exercises off Hawaii, and afterwards she embarked on a Southern Pacific cruise that included stops in Samoa, Australia, and New Zealand. Like her sisters, she underwent a major refit in the early 1930s to up her firepower, speed, and protection, and like her sisters, she was transferred from the Pacific to the Atlantic at the outbreak of the war in Europe. In September 1941, Idaho was stationed in Iceland, busily escorting convoys, and she was there when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. Idaho and Mississippi would actually leave Iceland together after the attack on Pearl, 2 days after exactly, and she steamed through the Panama Canal, arriving in San Francisco in January 1942. In April 1943, she departed for the Aleutians, where Japanese forces occupied Attu and Kiska, and she served as the flagship of the bombardment and patrol force. The force that, by now as you'd be aware, included both of her sisters. During this campaign, she provided gunfire support to US Army troops on Attu, and she was preparing to attack Kiska when the news came through that Japan had withdrawn. Like her sisters, Idaho joined in the pummeling of Japanese defenses at Makin Atoll on the Gilbert Islands, and then the Marshall Islands, and she joined in for the assault on Kwajalein in 1944. The battleship then actually shelled Saipan, Guam, and Peleliu, before splitting from her sisters in January 1945 and joining the bombardment group heading north to Iwo Jima, bombarding the island's defenses on the 19th of February as the Marines went ashore, and then withdrawing to resupply at Ulithi Atoll. Idaho would join Task Force 54 as flagship bombardment Unit 4 to begin shelling Okinawa on the 25th of March 1945, and she was on station when the landings commenced on the 1st of April. The battle did bring over mass kamikaze attacks, but unlike her sisters, Idaho would lead a charmed life and avoid being struck by kamikazes during this phase of the war, entering Tokyo Bay on the 27th of August, carrying occupation troops, and being present when Japan formally surrendered. The old battleship would leave Japanese waters on the 6th of September and be sold for scrap alongside her sister New Mexico upon her return to the US. That concludes the life of the New Mexicos, and yes, they really did spend their time together like actual siblings. It's rare in history that ship classes actually do that.
The Pennsylvania class emerged from the Nevada design as essentially Nevadas with more guns. The Nevadas hadn't even fully hit the slipways yet, and they were already tinkering with the next best thing, and in mid-1911 feelers were put out for a new design. The Navy eventually settled on a design that was physically larger than the Nevadas, and was about 4,000 tons heavier at 32,400 tons fully loaded, but boasted 12 14-inch guns in triple turrets, had better armor, and could still make roughly 21.5 knots. Designs were approved in mid-1912, but immediately got locked in congressional hell because of costs. There were folks like Benjamin Tillman who wanted bigger, but for the most part everyone was raising concerns like, why do you want 2 entire new battleships that are supposedly the best in the world when you came to us last year asking for 2 battleships that are supposedly the best in the world? The 2 from last year have barely even laid down and you want more? The result was compromises. Congress funded 1 ship for 1913, the Pennsylvania, and 1 for 1914, the Arizona, which was far less than the 4 the Navy wanted in that time frame, but at this point people were starting to question the need for all these battleships, so the Navy just had to suck it up. The lead ship and name ship of the class, Pennsylvania, would be laid down on October 27th of 1913, launched in March of 1915, and completed and commissioned into the Navy on June 12th of 1916. Once her trials and preliminary exercises were completed, she was made flagship of the Atlantic Fleet and did precisely nothing during World War I, remaining stateside the entire time. She did host the then Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, several times, and she also hosted a certain Vice Admiral Alexander Kolchak at one point. In fact, she spent a shocking amount of time with major American politicians aboard, including multiple presidents and all sorts of ministers and congressmen. That said, she spent basically the entire interwar exercising and making diplomatic visits, and undergoing about 1,000 refits, including one major one in 1929 that was very similar to the one the Nevadas got, giving her more armor, more gun elevation, float plane catapults, torpedo bulges, and revamping her engine setup. This bumped her displacement to nearly 40,000 tons fully loaded, and we are definitely starting to get up there displacement-wise. In early 1941, she found herself assigned to the Pacific Fleet based out of Pearl Harbor, serving as the flagship of said Pacific Fleet. So, yeah. Unlike the Nevadas, Pennsylvania was actually in dry dock undergoing a refit on December 7th when the Japanese struck, alongside the 2 destroyers, Cassin and Downs. They were packed like sardines, and as such, they were very easy and tantalizing targets. She was attacked by 9 bombers in the second wave of aircraft, but she herself was only hit once, with a bomb smashing through her deck and blowing up one of her casemates. Cassin and Downs were not so lucky, with the former being hit twice and the latter once. Both destroyers caught fire, and this fire spread to Pennsylvania due to the way the ships were arranged. When the dock was flooded to try and contain the fires, the destroyers cooked off, raining Pennsylvania in debris and smashing up her superstructure. Despite this, she would be one of the few battleships to escape significant damage, suffering 15 killed and 38 wounded, with her damage being fully repaired by mid-January of 1942. Because she was put back together very quickly, Pennsylvania was the backbone of the American battleship force for a while. She briefly sortied at the Battle of Midway in mid-1942, but didn't get to shoot at anything. She then played a naval support role for the Aleutian Islands campaign in mid-1943, where she had a close encounter with a Japanese submarine, but some quick maneuvering saved her. Her time here ended in May when one of her fuel tanks blew up and she spent 2 months being repaired. Her next major action came in late 1943 at Macon Atoll in the Gilbert Islands, serving as the flagship for the amphibious invasion fleet dedicated to grinding their way across the Little Pacific Islands, a role she would retain going into 1944 during the Marshall Islands campaign. Later in the year, she also partook in the Marianas campaign, obliterating a troop transport one time when she ran into it accidentally. These campaigns culminated in the battles for Saipan and Guam, with Pennsylvania saturating the islands with thousands of shells. She took a brief break in August of 1944, then shelled Peleliu for a bit before shipping off for the Philippines in October. This brought her to the smackdown of the Surigao Strait, where Pennsylvania, along with several other veterans of Pearl Harbor, crossed the T for perhaps the last time in naval history and absolutely suplexed the Japanese task force. Pennsylvania didn't actually shoot because her fossil of a radar system meant she struggled to find targets in the darkness, but it made a statement if nothing else, and her AA would shoot down a few planes as compensation. She spent the next few months blowing up various Japanese-held islands before getting a quick refit and returning for Operation Iceberg against Okinawa. On August 12, 1945, she would become the last major American warship to be damaged in the war when a bomber broke through her screen and smashed a torpedo straight into her side, killing 20 people and causing her to take on a ton of water. But DCP was on point and she would survive. Her duty as flagship would be finally relieved by the Missouri in September, and she would get to enjoy a well-deserved retirement. Except no, she wouldn't. Her story ends with nuclear fire. She got cross-roaded in July of 1946, once again surviving both nuclear blasts, but being irradiated beyond usability. After testing, she would be blown up for real this time on February 10th of 1948 off Kwajalein Atoll, but in deep enough water that her wreck has not been found in the time since. USS Arizona was the second and final ship of the Pennsylvania class. Her stat line is basically identical to that of her sister, and as I mentioned, because Congress was being Congress, she was funded for the 1914 fiscal year. As such, she was laid down on March 16th of 1914, 5 months after her sister. They tried to get them as close together as possible so that they could be on the water at similar times, so their battleship force would never be lopsided. She would be launched in June of 1915 and would be completed and commissioned in October of 1916. Her early career was simple and uneventful. Apart from some technical issues during her shakedown that required dockyard time, she basically just exercised for the entire duration of World War I, since she never crossed the pond. She only actually went across after the war ended, sailing to France as a part of escorting the American delegation to the Paris Conference. While there, she took a brief trip to Turkey as a part of the ongoing crisis over there before being sent home. Her career for most of the interwar was pretty uneventful, basically just exercising and sailing around, save for a time in 1919 when she was given a flight deck for aircraft trials. No, Arizona will not be in the American carrier video. In 1929, she was given an extensive modernization that was basically the same as her sister's, with the addition of basically ripping out her insides and rebuilding them to bring her machinery up to modern standards. This would be completed by mid-1931, and she spent the rest of the decade, once again, mostly just exercising. One such exercise was a simulation of a carrier raid on Pearl Harbor, which is a bit grim, that's for sure. Otherwise, though, she provided relief for an earthquake in California, filmed a goofy rom-com called Here Comes the Navy, absolutely bodied a fishing trawler accidentally, and in July of 1936, one of her turrets almost exploded due to powder gases getting in during gunnery exercises. Otherwise, though, pretty uneventful right up until December 7th of 1941. This is probably the one y'all have been waiting for. Arizona was right behind Nevada in Battleship Row, stuck between the battleship and island and the repair ship Vestal. In the first minutes of the attack, Arizona was struck with 4 bombs in various places. The final bomb struck right near Turret 2. Nobody knows the exact specifics of what happened, but seconds after this bomb hit, Arizona cooked off. The forward half of the ship was burned out, and anyone inside was likely incinerated instantly as the ship split in 2. Theories revolve around the black powder magazine being hit causing a chain reaction, or simple human error with someone leaving a door open somewhere, but we will never know for sure. All that matters is that 1,177 men died with her, the largest single loss of life at Pearl Harbor. Among the dead were the ship's captain, Franklin van Valkenburg, and Rear Admiral Isaac Kidd, who would be the first American flag officer to be killed in any conflict. Both would be posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, along with Samuel Fuqua, the ship's damage control officer, for his heroism in helping evacuate as many men as possible. The ship sank in place and was declared to be a total constructive loss. Her superstructure would be scrapped in 1942, and her guns and rear turrets would be salvaged for other uses. Afterwards, it was determined that the Arizona would be left in place as a war grave, with her 1,177 crew as a memorial to those lost in the attack. In 1962, the wreck was designated as a national shrine, and the Arizona Memorial was built over top of her wreck, containing the names of those who lost their lives. The ship would be designated a historical landmark in 1989, and pieces of the ship are present at various places around the United States for remembrance. Her bell, in particular, hangs in the Memorial Center bell tower at the University of Arizona. The final survivor of the Arizona, Lou Contour, died in 2024, and the U.S. naval battle flag continues to fly from the ship's mast to this day.
Now, for the last 2 14-inch gun standard battleships, and arguably 2 of the better made dreadnoughts of the era, and certainly, in my opinion, 2 of the nicest to look at. This is brilliant, but I like this. It's so good. Tennessee was the first sister and namesake of the class, and she was laid down in May 1917 at the New York Naval Shipyard, launching in April 1919 and commissioning in 1920. She was around 600 feet long, as designed, and she had a displacement of around 32,300 tons. Tennessee was powered by a 4-shaft Westinghouse turbo-electric transmission system driving 8 oil-fired Babcock and Wilcox boilers, generating a top speed of 21 knots. And in case you wondered, that top speed limitation was the worst thing about these ships by far. I cannot stress enough just how much this hamstrung them. Like the New Mexicos and Pennsylvanias before her, she was armed with 12 14-inch guns arranged in 4 triple turrets on the centerline, placed in 2 super-firing pairs forward and after the superstructure. However, from the time of her build, these guns could actually elevate to 30 degrees, and so the sisters didn't require refits like the New Mexicos did during the interwar years to get that extra range. Tennessee spent the 1920s and 30s in the Pacific Fleet's routine rhythm of exercises and goodwill voyages. During these exercises, she actually gained a reputation as a crack ship, placing first in 22 and 23 for accurate shooting among the units of the battle fleet and earning the Battle E Award in 23 and 24. In 25, she would visit Australia and New Zealand on a goodwill cruise before continuing her career of exercises and being oddly accurate at blowing things up. On the morning of December 7th, Tennessee found herself moored along Battleship Row. The battleship West Virginia was tied up alongside her, Maryland was ahead, Oklahoma was abreast, and Arizona was astern. Long story short, she was hemmed in and would never get moving. Tennessee's crew scrambled to battle stations, but the circumstances made their situation pretty desperate. In short order, West Virginia was torpedoed and sunk, Oklahoma capsized, and Arizona exploded catastrophically, and the explosions showered burning oil all over Tennessee's stern, and the ocean around her was essentially set alight by burning fuel oil from Arizona and West Virginia. At 8:20, Japanese bombers hit Tennessee twice with the converted large caliber naval shells, the very same shells that had destroyed the Arizona, but neither detonated properly. The first penetrated the roof hull of Turret 3, disabling a gun, and the second struck Turret 2's center barrel and exploded, launching shrapnel that most likely was responsible for the death of the captain of the West Virginia, Mervyn S. Benningen, who had walked out on his open bridge. Despite the chaos, Tennessee's AA gunners were credited with shooting down at least 5 Japanese aircraft during the attack. While she didn't sink, she was completely stuck, and after the attack, getting the ship out was at first an impossibility. Tennessee remained trapped by the sunken battleships around her until Maryland could be pulled free on the 9th of December, and the keys to which Tennessee had been moored were actually destroyed to allow her to be towed out. By the 20th, though, she was on her way to Puget Sound Naval Yard under her own power, and by all accounts, the machine spirit inside was thoroughly pissed off about the entire situation. After initial repairs, the battleship was sent in for refit, and new torpedo bulges were installed, her internal compartmentalization was improved, and her superstructure was completely revised. The old heavily armoured conning tower was removed, and the smaller tower was erected in its place. Her weapons suite was overhauled entirely, and the mixed battery of older 5-inch guns was replaced by a uniform battery of 16 5-inch 38 caliber guns in those twin mounts. While her light anti-aircraft battery now consisted of 10 quadruple 40mm Bofors guns and 43 20mm Oerlikons. This refit was kind of insane, and it more than doubled her complement from 57 officers and 1,026 enlisted to 114 officers and 2,129 enlisted. Returning to service in May 1943, Tennessee now had a chance to get even, and she joined in the island hopping campaign, providing gunfire support during the Aleutians, where she shelled positions on Kiska, before coming to the Gilbert and Marshall Islands, where at Tarawa in 1943, Tennessee and Colorado provided extensive fire support to the Marines as they struggled their way ashore. At Eniwetok, the captain of the battleship ordered her just 900 meters from the beach at Parry Island, where he then proceeded to open up a barrage that continued throughout the day and absolutely leveled the island. He demolished all superstructures, knocking down every tree, and during this particular display of absolutely diabolical aggression, the ship even opened up at targets on the ground with her AA guns. She was that close. The Marianas Campaign in 1944 brought Tennessee to Saipan, Guam, and Tinian. Off Saipan, a Japanese battery of 4.7-inch field guns hidden in caves opened up and scored 3 hits, one of which actually disabled a secondary turret. 8 men were killed and another 25 were wounded. In response, she then teamed up with her sister California and flattened Tinian town with a barrage of 480 shells from their main batteries and 800 shells from the 5-inch guns. Tennessee's most historically significant action would come during the Battle of Surigao Strait, though, which I spoke a bit about before during the section on Mississippi. Tennessee was the second ship to open fire, and she concentrated her barrage on the Japanese battleship Yamashiro. The Japanese ships were rapidly overwhelmed within 12 minutes of shooting, and Tennessee had fired 69, armored-piercing shells. Her bloodlust not yet satisfied, Tennessee was present for the battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, and at Iwo Jima she systematically dismantled the Japanese defenses, firing over 2 days during the pre-landing period, while also receiving wounded sailors from damaged gunboats in her sickbay. By the time she withdrew from the area on the 7th of March, she had fired 1,370 shells from her main battery, 6,380 secondaries, and 11,481 shells from her 40mm guns. At Okinawa, the battleship joined in the bombardment of the island, but on the 12th of April 1945, she would be hit by a kamikaze that struck the signal bridge, killing 22 and wounding 107. After emergency repairs, Tennessee returned to the firing line in a matter of days. Over the course of the war, Tennessee had fired 9,347 shells from her main battery, 46,000 secondaries, and over 100,000 rounds of anti-aircraft ammunition, and for that, she would receive 10 battle stars for her wartime service. After Japan surrendered, Tennessee covered the occupation landings and then made the long voyage home, sailing around the Cape of Good Hope rather than through the Panama Canal. because the ship's new anti-torpedo blisters added in 43 increased her beam too greatly to pass through the canal. Yes, the Tennessee was now too thick for Panama. Take that, Iowa. Tennessee had curves. She was the only 10 I saw. Oh, kill me. She was decommissioned in February 1947 and sold for scrap to Bethlehem Steel in 1959, but her bell was saved and put on display in Huntsville, Tennessee at the Museum of Scott County. My final battleship on the list is an interesting one, purely because she's one of the few battleships to actually be built on the West Coast and in her home state, which is kind of just neat. California's keel was laid down in October 1916 at the Mare Island Naval Shipyard in Vallejo, California, though work was halted briefly during World War I while the shipyard did focus on smaller, faster-to-build craft. She was launched in November 1919 and commissioned in 1921. The 2 decades between the war kept California busy with fleet exercises, goodwill missions, and incremental modernizations. On the night of the 11th of November 1924, Lieutenant Dixie Kiefer took off from the ship, and this marked the first 9-aircraft flight launched from a battleship in history. She then joined in on the little voyage to Australia and New Zealand with her sister and the few other New Mexicos before returning to training and waiting duties. The Navy would fit radar aboard California in 1940, which made her one of the first adopters of the new technology in the US Navy, and later that year President Roosevelt ordered the battle fleet to remain in Hawaii permanently. On December 7th, the California found herself as the southernmost ship in Battleship Row, and due to the fact it was peacetime and an attack wasn't expected, the ship had actually been prepared for inspection the night before, and all her watertight doors were open throughout the vessel. The crew would struggle to get them closed during the attack, and this compounded the issues when she was hit. At 8:05 in the morning, a pair of Nakajima B-5N torpedo bombers dropped their torpedoes toward the California, and both struck the ship, one forward and one further aft. The watertight integrity was already compromised by these doors being open, and flooding would spread rapidly throughout the ship, with the torpedo blasts also rupturing the forward fuel tanks, which allowed water to enter the fuel system and contaminate it, shutting down the ship's electrical system, and this made damage control essentially impossible. A bomb strike around 8:45 made things worse, with the bomb penetrating her upper deck, ricocheting off the second deck and detonating in the ship's interior, causing extensive damage and starting a serious fire. This killed around 50 men, and as the smoke spread throughout the ship and forced men from the engine room, the pumps stopped dealing with the damage caused by the first torpedo strikes, and the ship sank, settling into the mud. Granted though, Pearl Harbor was quite shallow, so she would be salvageable. Over the course of the attack, 104 men were killed, 61 were wounded, and 4 were awarded the Medal of Honor for their actions that day. Interestingly, this attack on California and her sinking was portrayed in the old PS2 game Medal of Honor Rising Sun, which plays a huge part in my childhood and my learning of World War II as a kid. So it's worth pointing out because I'd wager a lot of people who are watching this video have probably played that. Unlike her sister, salvage would take months, with workers patching the hull and pumping out the water before finally refloating the ship on the 25th of March 1942. It didn't really go smoothly during the salvage operations either, because on the 5th of April the ship suffered an accidental explosion, which was most likely caused by fuel oil vapor and hydrogen sulfide gas, which dislodged the initial patchwork and caused the ship to have some serious flooding. Once temporary patchwork repairs were complete, California set off for Puget Sound with a comprehensive reconstruction that would last from October 42 to January 44. All of the ship's guns, save the main battery, were removed and her superstructure was raised. California's hull was widened, and she was given more anti-aircraft and a similar uniform secondary battery as her sister Tennessee. Horizontal protection was considerably strengthened during this refit too, with special treatment steel added over the magazines and elsewhere, and her old cage masts were also ripped down and replaced. Like Tennessee, she essentially doubled her crew complement, which admittedly did make these ships somewhat cramped, but good lord could they put down a lot of hate downrange. California would rejoin the fleet in early 1944, and her first role was to bombard Saipan, Guam, and Tinian. While underway on the 23rd of August, Tennessee would actually suffer a steering malfunction and ram California, which would tear a hole in her bow and kill 7 crewmen. The collision would prevent the California from taking part in the Battle of Peleliu, and she would retire for repairs. With repairs complete, she rejoined the battle fleet at the Battle of Surigao Strait, where California was actually the ship that, using her radar, picked up the Japanese ships at a range of 42,000 yards. She would engage the leading Japanese vessel at 20,000 yards with a 6-gun salvo, and over a course of the action, California would fire 63 shells from her main battery. In January 1945, a kamikaze would strike the battleship's port side abreast of the mainmast and start a fire. Somehow, a 5-inch shell from a nearby Allied ship also hit the California at the same time and started a secondary fire. Both fires were suppressed quickly, but 44 men were killed and 155 were injured. Repairs would be made and the battleship would make her way to Okinawa to bombard the island. California's crew would receive word of the Japanese surrender while undergoing brief maintenance periods in the Philippines in August 1945, and she would steam into Wakayama, Japan to support troops beginning the occupation, before proceeding to Yokosuka. Her return home was kind of a world tour again due to being too thick for the canal, and California would sail through the Indian Ocean with brief stops in Singapore, Colombo, Cape Town, and the South Atlantic Islands before reaching Philadelphia on December 7th, 1945. She was placed in formal reserve in August 1946, decommissioned in February 1947, and sent for scrapping in 1959. All that remains today of the ship is her massive bronze bell, which was put on display in Sacramento at the California State Capitol Park.
The final set of American dreadnoughts were the Colorado class. In practice, this means they were the last battleships to be completed before the onset of the Washington Naval Treaty. As such, they are legitimately just good ships all around, and as with all just good things, they were a product of politicking. 16-inch guns as a concept had been proposed as early as 1911, but the Navy didn't want the really big guns to make the ships that were still under construction feel inadequate, so 16-inch designs were deliberately held back for a while. The first 16-inch gun would be successfully tested in 1914, which almost led to the cancellation of the Pennsylvanias because their 14s were now suddenly obsolete, but politics and practicality saved them from development hell. The penny pinchers in Congress and the Navy didn't like the idea of 16-inch guns because they would lead to a massive increase in cost and weight, so the Tennessees and New Mexicos would also feature 14-inch guns. It wasn't until 1916 when everyone finally settled on a 16-inch armed battleship design for the 1917 fiscal year. However, this was still a compromise design. The plan was to essentially build another set of Tennessees, but to give them 8 16-inch guns in 4 double turrets. And that is exactly what they were. What came to be known as the Colorados are basically super Tennessees. Their dimensions are similar, their machinery is similar, they had nearly identical armor, and their displacements are remarkably similar. The final design for the Colorado weighed in at 34,130 tons fully loaded, and had a top speed of 21 knots. Who needs speed when you have weight of fire? 4 of these ships would be ordered in 1916, however 3 would not begin construction until long after World War I had ended. Anyways, the first of the Colorados was the Colorado. Nope. Wrong, it was Maryland. By 2 entire years, actually. There was a rather significant time between constructions, largely because money, with Maryland coming first. She was laid down on April 24th of 1917 and would be launched 3 years later in March of 1920, and would be completed and commissioned in July of 1921. Because she missed World War I and was the biggest and shiniest ship in the Navy at the time of her completion, her interwar career was utterly uneventful. Granted, par for the course at this point, but she basically just exercised, sailed around, and underwent a couple of minor refits. She survived the arrival of the Washington Naval Treaty by virtue of being brand new, and actually was a major part of the negotiations for said treaty, since she had 16-inch guns, and as a condition of the Americans keeping the ship, they allowed for the Japanese Nagato and Mutsu to continue to exist, and allowed the British to build a pair of 16-inch armed battleships of their own, the Nelson and the Rodney. Along with the nearly finished Colorado and West Virginia, the group is sometimes colloquially referred to as the Big Seven, the only 7 battleships to carry 16-inch guns for much of the interwar period. But of course, the interwar chicanery was interrupted by World War II. Maryland was also at Pearl Harbor in Battleship Row on the inside of the formation next to Oklahoma. This proved fortuitous, as Oklahoma ate literally all of the torpedoes that would have hit her, allowing the battleship to mobilize and get her AA guns operational. Her gunners were able to shoot down multiple Japanese aircraft, and her crew was augmented by survivors of the Oklahoma. During the following Japanese bomber attack, Maryland was hit with 2 bombs, but neither hit anywhere particularly significant. She took on some water from one of them hitting in a funky spot, but otherwise the ship fought on, her crew even mobilizing to aid damage control efforts on her compatriots. Remarkably, only 4 men would die aboard the ship. She was able to limp to Puget Sound for repairs and an overhaul, putting her back in action at the end of February 1942. She primarily undertook small-scale escort and sweep missions around the South Pacific for most of that year and the next, her first major combat mission coming at the Battle of Tarawa in November of 1943, where she served as the flagship for the invasion fleet. Her guns obliterated a bunch of Japanese coastal batteries and machine gun nests covering the marine landings around the atoll. Her next mission was Kwajalein Atoll in late January 1944, where she again blew up Japanese positions, firing so many shells so quickly that one of her guns straight up broke. After repairs, she partook in the campaign for Saipan in June, literally flattening parts of the island until June 22nd, when a Japanese torpedo bomber broke through the screen and smashed her with a torpedo, killing 2 and forcing her out of the action. In a testament to the effectiveness of American naval industry by this point, this potentially ship-sinking devastating damage was repaired in a mere 34 days, sending her back into action for the Battle of Peleliu. Then, in October, she was sent down to join the fun at Leyte Gulf, during which she was present at Surigao Strait on the 25th, shelling the Japanese ships and definitely hitting something, although in the confusion it would have been hard to tell. She was rewarded for this victory with a Japanese kamikaze attack a month later, killing 31 and wounding 30 more. Once again, though, the immortal Maryland shrugged it off and was back in action after some repairs in time for the Battle of Okinawa in mid-1945. However, on April 7th, she would be hit with another kamikaze plane, killing 16 more and causing her 20mm AA ammo to blow up. She continued to shell Okinawa for another whole week before being peeled off for repairs. Absolute unit. By the time repairs and another refit were completed, the war was over, so her last major task was the repatriating of troops from overseas. After this, she would be decommissioned in April of 1947 and kept in the inactive reserve fleet until 1959, when she was unceremoniously sold off for scrap. The second and name ship of the Colorado class was the USS Colorado. Her construction, along with that of her other sisters, was kicked down the road until 1919 and 1920, with Colorado herself being laid down on May 29th of 1919. She would be launched in March of 1921 and would be completed and commissioned in August of 1923. Due to her status as an interwar battleship, she did nothing for short of 20 years, save for, again, exercising and sailing around, losing a fight to a reef in the Hudson River, and in 1937 joining the search effort for Amelia Earhart. Her nothing ever happened streak continued into World War II, as she was in Puget Sound being refitted when Pearl Harbor was bombed. She did some more exercising and then was basically just conjoined at the hip with Maryland, being stationed in the South Pacific for most of 1942 and 1943, just in case the Japanese tried anything funny. Her first major engagement came at Tarawa in October of 1943, where she blew up a bunch of stuff with her sister, after which she spent the first couple months of 1944 blowing up various Marshall Islands. She then spent a couple more months in refit, and in June she joined the battle over Saipan, Guam, and Tinian. This is actually a geography video. I hope you like learning the names of tiny irrelevant islands. At Tinian, she had an issue. On July 24th, she was caught off guard and got smoked by Japanese shore batteries, killing 43 and wounding 198 more, forcing her back for repairs. Once these were done, she returned to the theater just in time for the beginning of Leyte Gulf in October, only to immediately be hit by 2 kamikaze planes, killing 19 more men. However, damage was less severe, so she still stuck around bombarding islands for a while before heading to port for more repairs. She was back in the fight just after New Year 1945, only to immediately get friendly fired, which killed another 18 sailors and forced her to get even more repairs. Unlucky, man. Her final action was at the Battle of Okinawa, thankfully with no further incidents, and when the war ended, she was selected as one of the ships to take part in the occupation of Japan, delivering troops to the main islands and covering their landings in case any Japanese diehards tried anything. She left Japan in September of 1945, undertook a few repatriation voyages, and was placed into reserve. She was decommissioned in January of 1947 and sat around until she was sold for scrap in 1959. Washington was the third ship of the Colorado class, but only kinda. Washington was fully accounted and paid for as a part of the 1917 budget stuff, and she would be laid down on June 30th of 1919 once the post-war chaos started to alleviate, and her construction would progress significantly, being launched in September of 1921. However, when she was 75% complete, the Washington Naval Treaty was signed. GG no re. Construction was halted and never resumed. She sat around for a while before the Navy decided to blow her up for practice, and in November of 1924, her hull was towed out to sea and blown up. Wasn't a complete waste. Her sinking led the Navy to recommend that all battleships be given stronger deck armor and triple-layered hull armor. But yeah, otherwise not much to talk about. And last, but certainly not least, is the USS West Virginia, the fourth and final Colorado class, the final American dreadnought, and the last American battleship completed until the North Carolinas of the late 1930s. She would be laid down on April 12th of 1920, would be launched in November of 1921, and would be completed and commissioned in December of 1923. Her interwar career was, once again, utterly uneventful, but she did have a persistent problem with her steering breaking down constantly, causing her to run aground once in 1924. Otherwise, once again, just a lot of exercising. There were plans to modernize her along with her sisters, but these were rejected multiple times in the 1930s due to money. The ship would have to basically sink for them to commit to rebuilding her in such a way, especially with her slow speed. Well, surprise Pearl Harbor would see that come to fruition. West Virginia was moored next to Tennessee, just outside of the formation, which was just a terrible spot to be in as it turned out. She got hit with 7 torpedoes and 2 bombs, which effectively destroyed much of the ship and caused her to sink quickly. She didn't capsize thanks to the crazy effectiveness of American damage control, and she managed to score some kills as she sank. Of particular note was a mess officer, Doris Miller, manning a gun despite having no prior training and proceeding to shoot down anywhere from 1 to 6 planes, for which he earned the Navy Cross, but was snubbed for the Medal of Honor because racism. As she settled and the crew evacuated, leaking oil from the Arizona set her on fire, burning through large parts of the ship before they could be extinguished. 106 sailors would be killed in the process. Despite the horrendous damage she received, the US Navy exists to spite God and simply decided to put her back together again. She was refloated in May of 1942 and dry docked for repairs and an extensive modernization. However, Tennessee and California were rebuilt first, so she had to sit around for a while, but after that she was actually modernized. Her deck armor was nearly tripled, she was given torpedo bulges, her superstructure was fully rebuilt, all of her guns were given modern fire control radar, and her AA battery was massively expanded. As a result, she effectively became a subclass of the Colorados, having such a glow-up that she was basically a new ship. Her reconstruction was completed by July of 1944, and after working back up, she was shipped off to Leyte Gulf in October. She was almost immediately blown up by California when she accidentally cut the chain of a naval mine, forcing West Virginia into a crash maneuver to avoid it. Her first action came at the invasion of Leyte itself, firing thousands of shells in invasion support. After this, she found herself at the Surigao Strait. With her super modern electronics, she definitely hit stuff, smashing Yamashiro at least once and raining hell on the other Japanese ships. After getting some quick repairs, she spent most of November patrolling the Leyte Gulf and being repeatedly harassed by kamikaze planes. She spent the next 2 months shelling various islands as the Americans advanced before shipping off to prepare for Iwo Jima in mid-February. She spent a month at the island while the Marines grinded through it, shelling everything that could possibly be shelled. After this, she went up to Okinawa, once again providing fire support. She almost obliterated a destroyer when she got turned around in the dark one time, and on April 1st, she got hit with a kamikaze plane, killing 4 but not doing extreme damage. She remained on station for the remainder of the campaigns, save for spending part of May undergoing quick repairs, and once Okinawa came to its end, she actually began training for the invasion of Japan, but the war ended before that became necessary. Not to be tied down, she invaded Japan anyway, aiding with the occupation of Tokyo and being present at the surrender of Japan in Tokyo Bay. After the war ended, she helped repatriate troops from around the Pacific. Before, in January of 1946, she was shuffled off to be placed in strategic reserve. She was formally decommissioned in January of 1947 and would eventually be sold off for scrap in mid-1959.
Well, that's it. That's the story of every single American Dreadnought battleship from the very beginning to the very end. And yeah, this counts as a 5-minute history video, which is why you didn't get one on Wednesday. You can all thank USS Texas for his request. No, I'm not kidding, his name is USS Texas. Thank you to Spartan for joining me on this marathon, and I hope you all go and check out his videos and enjoy. Like I said, he's got one on Russian carriers, so it's right up all your alley. Let's never do this again. Help.